You ask about Orlando in 1950 and why we moved there. We moved there from Ohio because my dad, a CPA, was taking a position with an accounting firm that had offices in Jacksonville and Orlando. He was going to work as a CPA for the princely sum of $400 a month. That would support my mom, him, and my two sisters, and me. Orlando was a citrus town. There was no tourism. It had about slightly over 50,000 people as a population. Um, the schools were large, but there were very few of them. I went to Cayley Elementary, which didn't have, it was tiny. It had one sixth grade. Elementary school went to the sixth grade. Then we went to junior high school, and I went to Howard Junior High School, which actually was in what had been Orlando High School, because by that time they had built two high schools. Although later we were reminded that actually there were three high schools. Two high schools were white, the other high school was black, and the schools were all segregated. When that situation is the way you live, you don't really think about where other races might go to school. Our high school was William R. Boone. We went 10, 11, and 12 was the high school. And you found it very amusing that one of the very popular parts of our high school was the fact that we had our own orange grove. Future Farmers of America was very important. Orlando was a citrus town. It was in the center of the state, and a lot of tourists who went either to the East Coast or the West Coast didn't even know Orlando existed. Now I think everybody knows it exists. The Cold War was something we were all aware of. Although we didn't necessarily name it, we just knew there was a very scary red menace. We could be bombed. We had bomb drills when we literally went and ducked under our desks. I guess that was supposed to save us. We all saw movies about the atomic tests and the houses completely blown over. On a more geographically close encounter was the proximity of Cuba to Florida. And there were, at that time, there were Cubans who were fleeing to Florida to escape the conflict down there. Batista was in charge. And like most students, we all thought Castro was going to be the salvation of Cuba. I did have a wise history teacher who apprised us that that was not necessarily going to be the case. Back in the late 50s, she very clearly predicted that Cuba was exchanging one dictator for another. Even though he was on the front cover of Life magazine and everybody's hero, she did not think Castro was going to be much of an improvement for the Cuban people, and of course, how right she was. My father took a business trip to Miami during this period, and he came back and told us about gun emplacements on the beach in Miami because they were concerned about an invasion of Russians who were supporting the Castro efforts and later, of course, the Castro regime. Of course, there were academic differences when we were in high school, not quite so stratified as the ones we see now, not so formalized. We had, well, everybody knew who was smart and who wasn't. We had the general academic, we had the college bound, and then, of course, there were the people who pretty much took print shop and mechanics and maybe even some of those future farmers. But it was a generally very homogeneous group. I mean, everybody was Christian. There were some Jewish students. I don't think there was anything other than that. And course, you found it interesting that every day started with a Bible verse, a prayer, a salute to the flag. Trumpets played when the flag was raised on the flagpole outside. The academic differences were far more subtle than they are now. I mean, now you're either in an IB program or you're in an AP class or perhaps general. I'm sure there were students who needed extra help, who were had learning disabilities. I don't know where they went, and I don't know how their needs were met, because I never recall seeing or being with any students who weren't pretty much just plain folks. When I went to college, it was kind of a surprise to me that there were an awful lot of smart people. When you're in college, when you're in high school, it's kind of easy to skim by if the teachers think you're smart and you think you're smart and you're okay. But when you get to college, you kind of look around and wonder where all these smart people came from. I went to Florida State. My dad was opposed to my going to University of Florida because the spring I was a senior in high school, they had a panty raid, and my daddy didn't want me to go any place like that. I'm getting a very strange look because you don't know what that is. It's a little hard to explain. I don't think they do it anymore. He also thought Agnes Scott would have been a good place for me to go, but then he's a dad with 3 daughters. Moving to Atlanta to teach high school was pretty interesting. Atlanta was such a big city, and there were so many differences. I taught high school at O'Keefe High School, taught English, and I had mostly juniors and seniors. The early years when I taught were the years when Atlanta integrated their schools, and they integrated their schools with the high schools first. And O'Keefe was a very interesting situation. Most of our students came from public housing. They came from the mill villages that were nearby. But public housing at that time were primarily families, intact families, who were just low income. When we integrated the schools, the black children who came were primarily students whose parents either taught or were affiliated with Atlanta University. So I found myself in a situation where it was easier to identify with those students and families who were integrating because they were academically interested in their children's progress. They had high expectations for their students, whereas the students who came from the mill villages frequently would be the very first people in their families to graduate if they graduated from high school. They were frequently encouraged by their families not to excel academically, but to quit school so they could stay home and take care of the kids, or they could get a job at the mill. It was a very reverse situation from what I ever would have expected. But it was a great time to teach in Atlanta. The students were receptive. They were basically everybody interested in learning. The Vietnam War was starting to be a rather ominous presence. We had ROTC in the school, and there were some unhappy moments when maybe we would suggest that ROTC wasn't the best thing for very impressionable young men of 16 and 17 who really wanted to be very important and manly, and somehow signing up for the military would be a way to prove themselves. It was a very sad day indeed the first time I had to attend a funeral for one of my students who was far too young to have died in a war so far away. There was a situation where one of my students, very bright young man, was senior, and he was trying to decide because he was going to go to college. He lived in the Techwood Homes His dad drove a taxi cab, and he had 4 siblings. He was asked to interview at Emory. He came out of there and he was kind of surprised. I had taken him to the interview because it was easy transportation and I live near Emory. He came out of there and he was very philosophical but also amused that the people at Emory had just offered him more money to go to Emory than his father made in a year. He did not end up at Emory. He thought it would not be a good fit, and I think he's right. Instead, he went to Antioch, and he was very successful there.